Hi, I'm Jackson Crawford, and I'm joined here today by my good friend Dr. Luke Gorton of the University of New Mexico. We both talk on our YouTube channels, Jackson Crawford, is more or less what mine is called, and Word Safari, about the history of languages, and we often find intersections with the history of writing and the history of the alphabet. But when people ask us for more information about this, we have found there really isn't a good, accessible introduction to the history of writing, and more specifically of the alphabet. So we decided to make one. And in a couple videos spread between our two channels, we are going to take you from the dawn of alphabetic writing and the world in which it emerged up to the alphabet that we use to write English and so many other languages today. So Luke, let's talk a little bit first about some of the relevant terminology here. One thing that I want to get clear right away is that writing and language are not necessarily the same thing. So we're not saying that any language is older than another language, right? Something ancestral to English was spoken when Sumerian was written. And by the same token, languages and writing systems don't have to go together, and a language can be written in many different writing systems. So English could be written in Cyrillic and still be English. Russian can be written in the Roman alphabet and still be Russian. So we're looking at not the history of the language that's spoken, but rather the history of how it's represented in some kind of visual medium. All right. Now, Luke, when we get the first traces of alphabetic writing, we're talking about a little bit after 2000 BC.
Right.
What kind of writing systems already existed at that time?
Well, alphabetic writing came out of what we would today call the Middle East. That's the part of the world that it was really founded in. But by the time these what we might call proto-alphabetic systems arose or were invented, there was already a long history, a long tradition of writing in that region of the world. And the writing in that region of the world was really centered around and came out of two different cultures, one of them being Egypt, the other being the Mesopotamian cultures in what's now Iraq around the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And writing in that part of the world was really pioneered by the Sumerians, who were a culture who lived, again, in Mesopotamia. The Egyptians pioneered a writing system named hieroglyphics, which you've probably heard of, even if you don't know much at all about writing systems, because they seem to be cool. People talk about them a lot, even if they don't necessarily know how they work. And the writing system that was pioneered by the Sumerians originally in Mesopotamia, we call cuneiform, which actually just means they look like wedges. And they do look like wedges. If you Google image search for cuneiform, you'll see what I'm talking about. However, both of these writing systems started with pictures, and we know that pictorial writing goes back many thousands of years, well into the Stone Age. Humans have been drawing things on cave walls for a very long time, drawing animals, drawing other things. So, of course, this form of communication is very primeval. It's really been around for a long time, and that's where these two writing systems came out of as well. But then they evolved away from that into more stylized drawings of things that may have started out as pictures of animals. And sometimes, like in the case of hieroglyphics, they're still very recognizably pictures of animals. But when you get to the cuneiform, the Sumerian cuneiform, at least the mature version, you can't really tell what those pictures are of anymore. It's just a bunch of wedges that maybe originally looked like a bowl or something like that, but you can't really tell it's a bowl anymore. You have to really learn the system to sort of understand how that worked.
Well, and for the record, let's make clear that even though these particular writing symbols are derived from pictures, they have made the conceptual leap from painting a scene to a particular stylized picture representing a semantic word, right? It doesn't necessarily represent the pronunciation of the word, it represents the conceptual word, right? So it represents the concept water as used in a sentence, right? Not necessarily the pronunciation water, right? Wa-a-ta, right? Okay, so these are originally logographic systems, which means each symbol stands for one conceptual word. We still have that in some living languages today. Chinese is still written logographically. Now, there are advantages to logographic writing. One is that you don't have to reteach it over the generation. Well, you have to reteach it, of course, to people when they're young, but you don't have to change it as the language changes, because the pronunciation of the word can change completely, but you still have a word for water, which that symbol is going to represent. So someone who can read Chinese today can read classical Chinese as well, because the symbols haven't changed, even if the pronunciation has changed as radically as, say, from Latin to French.
I would also like to point out that this is something that if you're unclear or a little bit fuzzy as to how this works, we do this with one particular set of things, objects, items, concepts today in English, and that is numbers.
Yeah.
Our numbers are a logographic writing system. So when we draw a 1, or however you draw your 1, that's a symbol. It doesn't tell you how to pronounce that thing, right? If you're speaking Spanish, you might see that same number and say uno. But if you're speaking English, you would see that same number and say 1, and this is really referring to what Jackson was just talking about, where you don't have to learn or relearn how to actually pronounce that. So numbers are a great example of how there are still some logograms hanging out in English today. That's really where we all started. In these really ancient writing systems, the evolution was first from pictures to logograms, to one symbol being a word, and it didn't necessarily tell you how to pronounce it, and you would just pronounce it the way you pronounced it in your language.
Right. Well, and that's really well observed, that numbers represent logographic writing, even in traditions that use alphabets now. Now, another change that had, a revolution has occurred a little bit in some areas as of about 2000 BC, and that is the transition to syllabographic writing, where you have symbols that represent particular syllables, particular possible syllables. So that means there's a different symbol for T than for ta than for toe, right? We haven't quite made the leap to one particular symbol for ta that's then recombined with a symbol for a, e, I, o. But for many languages, this actually works pretty well, because you have a fairly predictable syllable shape. You know, a language that's mostly consonant vowel, this works pretty well, right? Now, one particular language where this is adapted is Akkadian, an early Semitic language, used, of course, in ancient cities like Babylon. And it works pretty well. You said better than I thought it would.
Yeah, it works okay. So the language that was, or rather the writing system that was pioneered by the Sumerians, who were not speaking a Semitic language or Indo-European, it's maybe distantly connected to some other languages of today, but there is a debate about that. Either way, it wasn't connected to most of the other languages of the region of antiquity. And in Sumerian, they had a very simple syllable structure. It was what we call CV, consonant vowel, and they were the ones who, again, pioneered this development from picture to logogram, and then began to include this phonetic component. So, for instance, the most famous example of this that you see in all the textbooks, if you've ever seen this, is that the Sumerian word for arrow was T. It sounds like the drink tea in English, but we usually spell it T-I. And the Sumerians realized that when they drew an arrow, you would say that T because it's an arrow. But you could also write T for anything that sounded like T. Anytime you had another word with the syllable T in it, you could draw an arrow for that syllable. And this is actually how that conceptual leap occurred. As it turned out, from what I understand, not a Sumerian expert here, the word for life in Sumerian was also T. And so they started drawing an arrow for life, even though arrows and lives don't necessarily have anything to do with each other. The Semitic speakers in Mesopotamia took over this Sumerian system. They said, well, we can also draw an arrow for T, or something, that may have evolved from an arrow, but it looks a little more stylized in the cuneiform. And so they could use that same symbol, that same thing you draw, grapheme as we call it, for the syllable T in their language, even though their language had nothing to do with Sumerian. It was the languages were not related. They could take that same writing system, that same phonetic component, and use it in their language, which, as Jackson mentioned, was called Akkadian. And that writing system really lasted for almost 2,000 years before it eventually died out. This was really the vibrant writing system of all the cultures of that part of the world, from the second millennium BC on into the pretty late first millennium BC.
Yeah, and that's the rebus principle, correct? where you take a sign that means, for example, T, and then use it to rewrite anything that has that particular sound sequence. We do this sometimes in children's games, right, where it's like be kind, but you have the word be written as a B. Okay, but then if the rebus principle produces syllabographic writing, the acrophonic principle is what gives rise to the first alphabetic writing, in which one symbol represents one sound regardless of what it's combined with. And where do we see this originally happening?
So this really is a revolution in the conceptual history and development of writing, because in both the cuneiform system in Mesopotamia and in the hieroglyphic system in Egypt, as mentioned, it started out logographic, and then it developed a pretty strong phonetic component as the 3rd millennium BC went on. So by about 2000 BC, the phonetic components in both hieroglyphics and the cuneiform are very well established. You can read a lot of both of those writing systems if you know the phonetic values of certain characters. However, let's say you don't know the values of certain characters and you're just looking at the hieroglyphics or the cuneiform and you're scratching your head, like, what does this bird mean in hieroglyphics? And you don't know that bird stands for the sound w in the native Egyptian language because you don't speak the native Egyptian language. This is not just a hypothetical. This is a real historical situation that would have occurred many times in Egypt, because Egypt was surrounded by people and ethnicities who were speaking different languages from different language families, but Egypt was really kind of a hub, a mecca of culture, and perhaps more practically food in that particular time period, because it had the Nile River, and so when there was a drought in the region, for instance, in Canaan or Palestine, people would go to Egypt to survive. They would go to Egypt and buy food, and maybe live there for a while, and then, if possible, migrate back into what we would now call Asia, or the Middle East. Although I guess Egypt's part of the Middle East too today. So this is a thing that we know happened among Semitic speakers. Now, the Semitic language family is a language family that was spoken across most of what we today call the Middle East, minus Egypt, minus Turkey, and Akkadian that we were just talking about was the most widely written Semitic language. But there was another branch of the Semitic language family that's called Northwest Semitic, and languages such as Hebrew, which the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament is written in, and Aramaic, which later came to be important, and Phoenician, which was spoken along the coasts of mostly what's now Lebanon and Syria. These were all Northwest Semitic languages. Now, we know that there were people speaking Northwest Semitic languages who, again, for reasons of drought, oftentimes, and famine, would go to Egypt for a while and live there. So there is always a pretty vibrant migrant community. Migrant communities are not a recent phenomenon in world history. This was happening around 2000 BC, where there was a pretty constant flow of emigration and immigration to and from Egypt into Canaan, into the land of Canaan, what we would now call Palestine, Israel. So this is pretty well recorded in the oldest book of the Bible, Genesis, where a family of speakers of a Northwest Semitic language, you may have heard of them, Jacob and his 12 sons and their wives and their kids, what do? They migrate to Egypt because there is a famine in the land and they need to go down there to get food and to live. And of course, a whole drama ensues for 400 years, but we don't need to go into that. This is the historical situation that a very interesting and important revolution in the history of writing occurred. It occurred within this particular situation that we actually see in the book of Genesis. There were for other Semitic speakers besides the family of Jacob and his 12 sons. This was a really common thing that would happen during that time period, where these people would go from Asia to Egypt and cross the Sinai Desert. But when they got there, they probably didn't speak Egyptian. Why would they? They probably would have seen the hieroglyphs. And just like you can go look at hieroglyphs today, but you're probably not going to know what they are, right? You're not going to know how to read them. But you are going to know that those characters represent meaning. They represent language in some way. And if you get a little bit more into it, you're going to realize that they represent certain sounds. Even if you can't study from the Egyptian priests, who are really the ones who held all that knowledge, this wouldn't have been a system that the Egyptian commoners would have really known or been able to write or read in. This would have been something that was very much an upper class kind of thing. So if you're a Semitic peasant laborer from again what we would today call Asia, and the Egyptians did call them Asiatics, by the way. So that's a modern translation of an Egyptian word of people from what we would today call Asia. So these quote unquote Asiatics who would come into Egypt across the Sinai Desert wouldn't really be able to read this stuff, but one group of them, and we'll never know for sure who these people exactly were, except that they did speak a Semitic language, and they probably didn't speak the native Egyptian language, but they looked at hieroglyphics and they understood some of the concepts behind them. They said, we don't need to know hieroglyphics. We don't need to go through this fancy training in some temple to learn about this very difficult writing system. We can actually use it and sort of change it and adapt it to our own needs, and their needs were different than the needs of the Egyptians. So what they did is they came up with, as Jackson mentioned, the acrophonic principle. Acrophonic is a word that comes from two Greek words that mean it sounds like the first sound of a particular word. So here's an example of an acrophonic principle in English if we had an acrophonic principle. So Jackson is wearing a hat. Hat starts with the sound H. That's the first sound in the word hat, right? Let's say that I was trying to invent an acrophonic writing system. I would draw a hat, and because in the language I'm speaking, English, hat starts with an H. When I draw a hat, that's the sound H, because you know that hat starts with the sound H, so I really just mean the first sound of hat. So hat, or rather a picture of a hat, is our new letter H in this acrophonic writing system that I am just inventing on the fly here. That's essentially what these Semitic speakers did in Egypt around the beginning of the second millennium BC. In other words, 2000 BC, maybe a little bit after that. They took hieroglyphics, they took the concept of drawing a picture, but they used it in a very different way than the native Egyptians were using. The oldest inscription we have is from a place called Wadi El Hol, which is a great name. I think it means ravine of terror. Nothing to do with the alphabetic inscriptions there. This dates from a little bit after 2000 BC. It's in Egypt. I believe it's in Upper Egypt, actually. And it seems to be the oldest attestation of an ancestor to our modern alphabet. So our modern alphabet really starts with this acrophonic writing system that was invented by Semitic speakers from Asia who were living in Egypt and who decided to sort of take the idea of hieroglyphics and take it in a very different direction starting at this time period.
And what's the date on Wadi El Hol?
We think it's a little bit after 2000 BC.
Which is
very early. Yeah, this is Middle Kingdom. Middle Kingdom Egypt is really when this stuff was, when these innovations were happening. The next attestation of something like this is actually from a couple hundred years later, maybe 100 years later, from the Sinai Peninsula. So it actually, the oldest one is further down in Egypt, and then the second oldest one is up closer to where the Semitic speakers would have been coming from, or going back to when they were done doing whatever they were doing in Egypt. So we know that this system took root in the areas that we would today call, again, Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria. That would have been the real homeland of this alphabetic or proto-alphabetic system, even though it started in Egypt. It was probably invented in Egypt, but it was taken back home by these Semitic language speakers back into what we would, again, today call Asia.
And remarkably, the symbols, the particular visual symbols and the Wadi El Hol inscriptions have very easy to see visual consistency with the Phoenician alphabet hundreds of years later. And there's even recognizable words there. I think rabbi is there in one of those.
Semitic languages really haven't ever changed that much. They've always tended to be fairly conservative. Proto-Semitic was probably also spoken later than a language like Proto-Indo-European, so they had less time to change as well. But at that early date, the Semitic languages all have not diverged very far from each other, and their writing system works very well for them. One of the decisions that they made when they were creating this writing system was that they decided that they only needed symbols for consonants, not vowels. Now, there are a couple of reasons that this happened. One of them is that in the Semitic languages, there really weren't words that started with vowels, actually. So if you have an acrophonic writing system, unlike English, where we could come up with dozens, hundreds of words that start with A, E, I, O, U, no problem, that was not the case in the ancient Semitic languages. Basically, every word started with a consonant. Just because of the phonotactic constraints of their language family. So based on the acrophonic principle, they actually would have had a lot of difficulty creating vowel letters. But beyond that, the truth is that in the Semitic languages, they didn't really need vowels to write their language in an efficient and easily communicable manner. And we don't need to go too far into the weeds with this, but the root structure of Semitic languages is very heavily consonant based. So you can take what we call a triliteral root, that's 3 letters, such as D, B, R as consonants, and they're always going to be 3 consonants. And those 3 consonants mean something. That's like a fundamental root. So DBR in the Semitic languages is a root that has something to do with words. I mean, that's probably the best way to put it. If you make it into a verb, you put certain vowels in there. Diber can mean like he spoke in biblical Hebrew, but then dabar or davar can just mean word. So it's a noun. You can make a noun out of that. You can make a verb out of that. You can make other things out of that. But if you're just writing DBR, you know exactly what that means. Without the vowels, you can tell from the context whether it's a verb or a noun or whatever is going on with it. So these Semitic languages that developed the proto-alphabetic system we've just been talking about left out vowels, and I don't think they ever missed them, honestly. Even today, if you go to Israel, a lot of the street signs are written without vowels in the Hebrew alphabet because you can read it okay. Honestly, you don't necessarily need the vowels to be able to read this stuff. And here we are 4,000 years later, and vowels were added in some texts in Hebrew, for instance, but many times you don't need the vowels at all.
Well, and even in English, if you write just with consonants, it's a lot easier to figure out than if you write just with vowels.
Right. If you know the language, if you know English, you can read most things if the vowels are left out. There are going to be some things that are a little iffy, but the Semitic speakers didn't even really have that problem because of the nature of their language.
Now, the Phoenician alphabet, which is the sort of formalized descendant of the Sinaitic or early Semitic script that you're seeing in Egypt and Sinai a few centuries before, gets perfected as a sequence of 20-something?
22
symbols, which will then be exported to other parts of the Mediterranean, most importantly to Greece.
Yes.
And that is where we're going to pick up in the next installment of this, looking at the adaptation of the Phoenician alphabet into the multiplicity of Greek alphabets that existed in the ancient world. Final thoughts for this one?
I think that's a great place to leave it. The evolution from the early scripts that we were just talking about to Phoenician, it was pretty invisible because we just don't have a lot of. It's like we're missing the transitional fossils, if you want to think of it that way. But it's pretty clear that evolution happened. So by the time this script is attested again by the Phoenicians and in the Phoenician culture closer to 1000 BC. So 1,000 years have already passed at this point between the Wadi El Hol inscriptions and the efflorescence of this writing system in the Phoenicians culture. You get sort of the mature version of this what we might call alphabet or proto-alphabet, and as Jackson's saying, that's the one that really comes to be the most important one that gets exported from there.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll see you next time on Word Safari to look at the development from the Greek alphabets into our recognizable Roman alphabet. So for now, beautiful Colorado, we're wishing you all the best.